Somewhere in central Florida, in a marshy pond nobody had ever considered significant, construction workers in 1984 stumbled across something the environment should have destroyed thousands of years ago. Not fragments, not dust. Intact human remains preserved with a precision that left forensic specialists struggling to explain what they were looking at. 168 individuals, 8,000 years old. Brains still present inside the skulls and locked inside those brains. Something that the science of that decade was barely equipped to extract. DNA genetic material from the oldest confirmed human settlement ever found in North America. When researchers finally sequenced it, the results did not simply add a footnote to the existing story of prehistoric America. They forced the entire story to be rewritten. Who these people were, how long they had been there, and what kind of society they had already built long before anyone thought such complexity was possible. That is what the bog revealed. Steve Vanderjagt was not looking for history. He was operating a digger through a small, unremarkable marshy pond in Brevard County, Florida, clearing ground for a housing development. The year was 1984. The pond was black, shallow, and by every visible measure, completely ordinary. Then his bucket caught something. He stopped the machine and climbed down to look. It was round, dark brown, and at first he took it for a rock. Rocks are not common in that part of Florida, which is what made him pick it up. He turned it over. It was looking back at him. A human skull. His first assumption was the same assumption anyone would make. Someone had been murdered and dumped in the water. The police were called. A coroner examined the skull and noted something that immediately complicated the theory. The bone was dark throughout, stained by prolonged immersion in peat. This was not a recent death. This was not a police matter. The coroner made the call that would change the site's trajectory entirely. An archaeologist was needed. Glenn Doran was a young assistant professor at Florida State University, specializing in human skeletal remains. The call reached him, and he drove out expecting very little. What he found when he arrived did nothing to raise his expectations. A small, dark, uninviting pond, surrounded by unremarkable Florida scrubland. He walked the perimeter anyway. Within minutes, he was looking at clusters of human skeletal material eroding out of the peat banks. Then he found 4 more skulls, and the teeth told him something immediately. The wear patterns were extreme, the kind that accumulates only when teeth are used as tools rather than simply for eating. Modern people do not produce wear like that. Ancient people, people who use their teeth to grip, to work materials, to do the things hands and tools do now, did. He knew before any laboratory result came back that he was looking at remains from deep prehistory. Radiocarbon dating confirmed it. The bones were between 7,000 and 8,000 years old. 5,000 years before the birth of Christ, 3,000 years before the first Egyptian pyramid, 2,000 years before Stonehenge. The team described the results as walking on clouds. They had expected old. They had not expected this. The problem was immediate and enormous. The remains were underwater. The bog held millions of gallons, and anything excavated without controlled conditions would be lost within hours of exposure to open air. It took 2 years to engineer a solution. 150 well points were sunk into the peat, and pumps ran around the clock, pulling 700 gallons of water per minute out of the marsh. Slowly, the floor of the bog came into view. What the team saw when the excavation began was not what anyone had prepared for. The handful of skulls found by accident were not anomalies. They were the surface of something far larger. Body after body emerged from the peat. Men, women, children. Most were in the fetal position exactly as they had been placed by the people who buried them. The arrangement was deliberate and consistent across the entire floor of the marsh. When the full count was completed, 168 individuals had been recovered. Dating tests on the burial ground itself revealed it had been in continuous use for 1,300 years. This was not a single event, not a catastrophe, not a mass death. This was a cemetery. A prehistoric community had been returning their dead to this specific location generation after generation for longer than the entire span of recorded European history. The question was who they were. The first question any scientist asks when confronted with remains this old is simple. Why are they still here? Bone is organic material. Given sufficient time, moisture, bacteria, and acidic soil chemistry, it dissolves completely. In most environments, an 8,000-year-old skeleton leaves nothing behind. The Florida heat alone should have accelerated that process beyond any reasonable hope of recovery. And yet the Wendover remains looked in the assessment of forensic specialist cohorts who examined them like people who had died within the last few years. The explanation when it came was elegant and entirely accidental. The pond was a peat bog. Peat is decomposed vegetation compressed over centuries into a dense oxygen-poor medium that creates conditions hostile to the fungi and bacteria responsible for biological decay. The bodies had been submerged quickly after death, sealed into an anaerobic environment before decomposition could take hold. That alone would have slowed the process considerably. But Wendover had a second factor that made it exceptional, even among bog sites. The peat chemistry was non-acidic. Most bogs are acidic enough to dissolve bone over long periods, which is why bog bodies recovered elsewhere in the world often retain soft tissue while the skeleton itself deteriorates. At Wendover, the chemistry preserved both. If these individuals had been buried in ordinary dry earth instead, their bones would have been gone within a couple of years. The bog had done something no deliberate preservation effort of that era could have achieved. It had held them intact for 80 centuries. The excavation team understood they were working in an optimal preservation environment. What they did not yet understand was how far that preservation extended. The first indication came weeks into the dig, when a series of skulls proved far heavier than they should have been. Bone alone does not produce that kind of weight. Something was inside. When researchers looked into the cranial cavity, they could see a pale, compacted mass sitting where the brain had once been. The working assumption was peat intrusion. Organic material from the surrounding sediment filtered in over millennia and solidified inside the skull. It was the reasonable explanation. It was wrong. One skull, belonging to a woman estimated to have been around 45 years old at the time of her death, was transported to the University of Florida for imaging. An MRI scan removed any remaining ambiguity. The mass inside the cranial cavity was not peat. It had structure, defined biological structure. When researchers carefully removed it, the laboratory went silent. They were looking at a human brain reduced to roughly a quarter of its normal size through desiccation and the pressures of millennia in waterlogged sediment. But unmistakable, the folds were present. The overall form was intact. A human brain 8,000 years old recovered in a condition that allowed its cellular architecture to be examined under a microscope. 981 prehistoric brains were eventually recovered from the Wendover site. 91, the number itself requires a moment. These were not traces or impressions or chemical residue. These were the actual organs inside which 8,000 old thoughts had formed. The significance of that is not merely sentimental. Homo sapiens has not changed neurologically in 150,000 years. The brain sitting in a laboratory in Florida was not a primitive organ. It was structurally identical to the brain of the scientist examining it. The Wendover people were fully modern humans in every biological sense. Whatever they experienced, whatever they understood, whatever they felt about the world around them, they processed it with the same cognitive architecture we use today. The bog had not just preserved their bodies, it had preserved the evidence of their minds. The brains changed the question. Not just what had survived, but what might still be readable inside what had survived. Cellular structure visible under a microscope meant one thing to geneticist Bill Houseworth. If the architecture of the cells had held together across 8,000 years of waterlogged burial, there was a possibility, remote and unprecedented, that the cells still contained something. DNA is housed inside cells, damaged, fragmented, chemically degraded. After that length of time, almost certainly, but potentially present, potentially extractable, the attempt that followed was at that moment in the history of the science, the equivalent of reaching into the dark and expecting to find something that had no business still being there. The extraction process involved mixing samples of the ancient brain tissue with enzymes designed to break down cellular material and release any genetic content still locked inside. The samples were then subjected to cycles of cooling and agitation to isolate what remained. 7,000 years in a waterlogged environment should have destroyed it completely. Heat, moisture, microbial activity, and simple chemical time all work against DNA preservation. The Sahara had resisted ancient DNA recovery for decades for exactly these reasons. Florida was not the Sahara, but it was not Siberian permafrost either. Nobody seriously expected this to work. The results came back positive. Human DNA, not contamination from the surrounding vegetation, not environmental material carried in by the peat. Human genetic sequences recovered from brain tissue that had been sitting at the bottom of a Florida bog since 3,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids were built. Houseworth moved immediately to the contamination problem because that is where the entire result could unravel. Ancient DNA recovery is vulnerable to a specific and persistent failure mode. Modern human DNA from researchers handling the specimens can infiltrate samples and produce false positives. The sequences look human because they are human, just not the human being studied. Ruling this out required a comparison. Houseworth mapped the Wendover sequences against the known genetic profiles of different ethnic populations. The result was unambiguous. The DNA was distinctly Native American in type, a genetic signature with specific markers that distinguish it cleanly from European, African, and Asian profiles. Since no Native Americans had been involved in the handling or processing of the specimens, modern contamination could be ruled out with confidence. What he had recovered was genuine Stone Age DNA from the oldest confirmed human genetic material extracted anywhere on Earth at that time. The sequences carried information beyond simply confirming identity. They told researchers what these people looked like. Dark hair, dark eyes, dark skin, a physical profile consistent with modern Native American populations. This was not a mysterious lost race with no connection to the people who came after them. The Wendover people were the ancestors. The genetic signature present in those 8,000-year-old brains is the same signature that runs through the indigenous populations of the Americas today. They were not at the beginning of a story that would eventually become something else. They were the foundation of a line that is never broken. One individual was selected for facial reconstruction, a woman approximately 70 years old at the time of her death. One of the oldest individuals recovered from the site. Her skull was scanned and converted into a three-dimensional model. Tissue depth data and the DNA profile guided the application of facial features. Glenn Doran, who had spent 2 decades studying her remains without ever seeing her face, watched the reconstruction emerge on a screen. Dark skin, dark eyes, the classic bone structure of a Native American elder. 8,000 years collapsed into a single image. She looked back into a world that had forgotten she existed. The bones did not describe a people on the edge of survival. That is the assumption that attaches automatically to the phrase Stone Age hunter-gatherer, a marginal existence, bodies worn down by scarcity lives measured in the effort required simply to continue living. The Wendover skeletal record said something different. Some of the men stood nearly 6 feet tall. Bone density across the population indicated robust physical health. These were not people eking out a meager existence in a hostile environment. This part of Florida 8,000 years ago was extraordinarily resourced with rivers, dense with game, bordered by coastline that supplied protein year-round. The land was feeding them well, and the bones showed it. A technique called radioisotopic analysis pushed the understanding further. Norrin Kouros of the Smithsonian Institution measured stable isotopes of hydrogen preserved in the bones, a chemical fingerprint that reflects the water a person drank during their lifetime. Water chemistry varies by geography. Drink from one source long enough, and the signature embeds itself in your skeleton permanently. The Wendover team had also recovered bones from local animals that died in the bog during the same period. When the hydrogen isotopes of the humans were compared against those of the animals, they did not match. The animals reflected the local water source. The humans did not. These people had not been living beside the bog. They had been ranging across the Florida peninsula, moving with the seasons, drinking from different water sources across a wide geographic area. Wendover was not their home. It was their cemetery, and they were traveling back to it deliberately, sometimes across considerable distances, to bury their dead in this specific place and nowhere else. The grave goods confirmed what the effort of that journey implied. Jewelry, ornaments, weapons carefully placed alongside the bodies, not scattered, not incidental, positioned with intention. The interpretation is straightforward. These people held a concept of what came after death. They were equipping their dead for it. The pond itself may have carried specific meaning, a boundary between the living world and whatever they understood to lie beyond it, a portal that made this particular water significant enough to cross a landscape to reach. Then came the textiles. Skeletons were found wrapped in woven fabric. The discovery stopped the excavation. Conventional understanding held that textile production this far back in time was not possible. Stone Age people wore animal hides. Weaving was a later development, a product of settled agricultural societies, not nomadic hunter-gatherers moving across the subtropical peninsula. America's foremost authority on ancient fabric examined the material in person. It was textile, twined weave, the oldest fabric ever recovered in the Americas. The wear patterns on the fabric added another layer. Adult burials showed cloth that had been worn before death. Garments used in life and carried into the grave. Infant burials showed fabric with almost no wear at all, made specifically for the burial ceremony. The distinction was deliberate. Someone had woven new cloth for a child's death. That is not primitive behavior. That is grief expressed through skilled handcraft. The clearest evidence of social complexity came from a single skeleton, a teenager with spina bifida. The spinal condition had left his legs paralyzed. He could not hunt. He could not contribute to the food supply. Every time the community moved camp, which a nomadic group in seasonal migration does constantly, he had to be carried. The physical burden of that across difficult terrain was real and unambiguous. The tribe carried him anyway. He lived into his teens, was cared for throughout, and when he died, he received the same deliberate ceremonial burial as every other member of the community. The bog does not record savagery here. It records something considerably more demanding than that. The DNA held one more revelation that reframed everything that had come before it. Houseworth had not simply analyzed a single individual or a handful of specimens. He had worked systematically across the genetic material recovered from brains spanning the entire 1,300-year lifespan of the burial site. What he found when he compared the sequences was not the genetic diversity you would expect from an open community drawing members from across a wide region. The sequences were nearly identical. Generation after generation, century after century, the same genetic signatures appeared in the same place. These were not strangers who happened to share a burial ground. They were family, an extended, interrelated clan, returning their dead to the same water across more than a millennium, maintaining a tradition so deeply embedded in their identity that it persisted longer than most civilizations have managed to exist at all. The tribe had not interbred with outsiders. The genetic record showed no outside influence entering the population across that entire span. In a period when human contact between groups was genuinely rare, the Windover people had remained a closed dynasty. The bog was not merely a cemetery, it was the physical center of a lineage. The place where the thread between the living and the dead was maintained, renewed with every burial, held intact across generations that never broke the practice. That kind of continuity does not happen accidentally. It is chosen deliberately, repeatedly by people who understood exactly what they were preserving. Then Grave 102, a male, late 20s to early 30s, in the full physical prime of his life. Alongside his remains, a spear point carved from deer antler. The initial assumption was a grave offering, a weapon placed with a hunter for use in whatever came next. Then the excavation continued. The point was not beside the body. It was inside it, driven deeply into the pelvis, the tip locked into bone with a force that had held it there for 8,000 years. Forensic pathologist Mike Warren applied the same analytical framework he uses at modern homicide scenes. The trajectory of the wound angled upward from below, which ruled out a ranged spear throw immediately. A spear launched at distance follows an arched trajectory and enters the body angled downward. This wound ran in the opposite direction. The man was already on the ground when the weapon was driven into him. The wound showed no signs of healing. It occurred at or around the time of death. But it was not the fatal injury. No vital structures were struck. Something else had killed him first. Most likely a spear strike between the ribs that passed through soft tissue and left no trace on the skeleton. He went down from the first blow. The second was delivered after. Then the detail that changes the entire character of what happened. His skull was missing, not displaced, not lost to sediment movement. Every surrounding skeleton in the bog was fully intact. His was not. The top 3 cervical vertebrae were also absent, the bones that connect the skull directly to the spine. Warren had seen exactly this pattern before in modern cases. He was decapitated. The method based on the fracture evidence at the remaining vertebrae was not clean. It involved a sharp stone tool, repeated cutting, and then force applied to separate the head entirely. Someone with the butchering skills of an experienced hunter applied to a human being. Warren's conclusion was precise. This was not warfare. Florida at this period was sparsely populated. The violence was personal. A grudge, a territorial dispute, an individual act of lethal anger carried through to its absolute conclusion. The head was taken, a trophy, a statement. Inside a community that had carried its paralyzed across landscapes and woven burial cloth for its infants, one man had been hunted, killed, and deliberately mutilated. Both things were true simultaneously. They always are. Return to what the bog actually produced. 168 individuals preserved across 8,000 years in an environment that should have made preservation impossible. 91 intact brains. The oldest human DNA ever recovered at the time of extraction. The oldest textile ever found in the Americas. A genetic record spanning 1,300 years of continuous family burial. A forensic homicide case solved without a single piece of modern evidence. Each of these findings would have been significant in isolation. Together, they form something larger than any individual discovery. They form a portrait. The Wendover people were not a footnote. They were not a primitive antecedent to something more developed that came later. They were a fully realized society operating at a level of social and technological sophistication that the existing models of prehistoric America had not predicted and were not prepared to accommodate. They were complex fabric. They maintained a sacred site across more than a millennium. They cared for their disabled across seasons of migration. They had belief systems elaborate enough to require grave preparation, journey, and ceremony. They had conflicts personal enough to end in decapitation. Every one of those facts points in the same direction. These were modern humans living modern human lives, 8,000 years before anyone thought to look for evidence of it in a Florida bog. The DNA confirmed what the bones implied and went further. The genetic continuity across 1,300 years of burial told researchers that this was not a transient population passing through a landscape. This was a people rooted to a place in the deepest possible sense, not geographically, because the isotope evidence showed they were nomadic, but spiritually and genealogically. The bog was the fixed point around which their entire identity organized itself. They ranged across the peninsula. They always came back. The DNA is the proof of that return, written in sequences so consistent across centuries that the fidelity of the tradition is measurable in the genetic record itself. What the science has not yet finished is the larger question. The window over DNA opens. The sequences recovered represent a population that had been in the Americas long enough to develop a genetic profile entirely distinct from the Asian populations they ultimately descended from. The crossing from Siberia to Alaska, the isolation on the Bingian land bridge, the southward expansion following the ice, and then the long settlement into geographic pockets across the continent. All of that happened before Wendover. These people were already ancient Americans by the time they began burying their dead in this pond. How far back that line extends and what other communities existed across the continent at the same period remains an open question. The databases are still growing. The recovery techniques are still improving. Ancient DNA work in hot and humid environments, long considered impossible for the same reasons that made Wendover itself so unexpected, is now a field that exists specifically because a Florida bog proved the assumptions wrong. There are almost certainly more sites like this one waiting, not identical in their preservation, not identical in their findings, but carrying the same potential to force a revision of what was thought to be settled. The Wendover bog was found by accident by a construction worker who climbed off his machine to look at something that seemed slightly wrong. The science that followed took decades and is not finished. Glenn Doran, who has spent his career at this site, has said he will probably never encounter anything like it again. He is likely right. But the questions Wendover opened about who the first Americans were, how long they had been there, and what they had already built before history began recording, those questions now have a method. The Boji gave them a starting point. The DNA made it readable. The rest is still being written. The two women buried at Takraori did not know they were the last chapter of a 50,000-year story. The man in grave. Tuak did not know his death would be reconstructed by forensic pathologists 8,000 years later. The teenager with paralyzed legs did not know that the people who carried him across a Florida landscape would one day be cited as evidence of prehistoric compassion. They were people specific, particular, irreplaceable people living inside a society that was fabric, honored its dead, and kept returning to the same water across more generations than most nations have existed. The bog preserved them. The DNA read them. What they revealed was not a primitive world, awkwardly preceding our own. It was the same world running on the same minds held together by the same impulses that still define us. We just needed 8,000 years in the right pond to see it.